I'm Sarah Cudmore from Homegrown Learning, and I'm joined today by my lovely fellow home edder, Sarah.
Hello.
So today we are unpicking what unschooling is and how it can work. But before we kind of delve into Sarah, who is an unschooler, let's just highlight, Sarah, what does unschooling mean to you?
Well, how we do things, we sort of radical unschool, which is a bit of a mouthful. And there's a lot of people that are unschooling, and we sort of taken this extra little bit of radical unschooling, which we got into after we'd started the unschooling journey. So for us, radical unschooling is taking the concept that your parents to your children, and when they're born, you don't teach them how to breastfeed, you don't teach them how to crawl, you don't teach them how to walk. You're just there partnering with them, creating a really beautiful environment that's safe, nourishing, enjoyable. You're loving them, and the idea is that they've got this innate capacity to learn and get involved with what they love, and you're just there to support that. And that's really what radical unschooling is. Unschooling, for us, unschooling was just not following any kind of formal learning or curriculum, but following their passions, but still putting in ideas of your own. So when we were unschooling, I was still buying some nice workbooks and saying, oh, let's do this, rather than sort of letting go a little bit more. Yeah. And I still used quite a lot of limits at that point as well.
Okay. And I guess it's quite funny because I think a lot of people think of unschooling and certainly radically unschooling as being like this new terminology and this new thing. But actually, it definitely isn't, is it? There's John Holt back in the 70s, I think, was a big part of this unschooling. And actually, I think it even dates back further with people talking about deschooling being a kind of unschooling version at the time. So let's go to you and your story, really, Sarah. So you have two children.
Yep.
And you didn't start off thinking you were going to home educate, did you?
No.
So tell us what happened for you. How did you get into home educating?
I think the seeds were there. I think just who my husband and I are, it really would have been a natural evolution for us to do that. But when we looked at schools and we heard about homeschooling a little bit, but not very much, I thought, oh my gosh, I cannot commit to doing 18 plus years of this. This is what I thought at the time. And so we were like, no. And we didn't really like the school system and what was there. We were quite realistic about it, but we thought we'd found somewhere that was the best of the bunch, and that actually maybe Theo could be really happy in. We wouldn't have gone ahead with it if we hadn't actually thought, yeah, I think he actually might really like this. Seemed to be quite play-based. There was a lot of outdoor play. It was just a state school, but everyone seemed quite friendly and kind. And we thought, let's just give this a go. This might be the way forward. So, yeah.
And I guess when you are choosing a school, the schools are so varied, aren't they? So you can actually, you can look around schools, and some schools do seem a bit more formal and some are more play-based. So how did it get on at school? Where did it change for you?
I think, looking back, I had much less of a tolerance than my other friends who had kids at school with Theo did have. And also my husband, we both had less tolerance. We both at that point in our life had a fear of authority. And we wanted to make it work. We wanted to partner with the teacher to make it work. But Theo has always been a little authenticity marker for us. He sort of looks at us sometimes like, what? Why would you do that? And it makes us drop all the societal baggage that we've inherited that's full of crap, And we go, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Yeah, that is a load of bullshit. And I think he did that with school on so many levels, but we tried to support him to make it work. But then he started to get bullied by a little boy in his class who was really quite distressed, and just latched onto Theo in quite a violent way. And when we tried to partner with the school around that, it was all policy and procedure. We're doing all the right things, but they were doing nothing to keep Theo safe. And Theo just said to me one day, he just said, "Mummy, you're not doing your job."
Oh.
And I was just like absolutely gutted, because we took parenting really seriously. We really did, and we thought we were doing everything we could. But it was just in that moment, I just thought, there's no way I can. Behind the scenes, we were meeting with the teachers, trying to get it all sorted. We were doing, I was going there every day, and but for Theo, it was still happening. It was still carrying on. The environment wasn't safe, and it wasn't changing for him, even though we were doing all this work. And I just was like, actually, I cannot send him back into that environment. It's not safe. It's not a place for him. And after we took him out, over the next couple of years, in bits and drabs, he as he regained trust in us, because he really disconnected through the school process from us, and he really lost his trust in us. He told us what it was like in school, what his experience was of school, was that, the teachers that we thought were nice were shouting, they were unfair, they were putting people on the naughty step, they had favourites, and all this stuff he found terrifying, because it was completely the opposite from our loving, nurturing environment we sort of created at home. And he'd found it terrifying, and he could not understand or fathom why we thought it was okay to send him there. He thought we would therefore be agreeing with that way of being. And he was just so confused and beside himself. So that was our experience of school.
And that's why it's so hard, isn't it? I mean, even the most caring of teachers, when you're faced with 30 children and you've got just one little issue to sort out, the time that takes is, for them, is taken away from the curriculum and this delivery. And, I talk to so many people that actually don't want to teach like they do.
No, absolutely.
So, okay, so was he year one? Or?
Yes, he did reception, and he did year one, and then we pulled him out at the end of year one with a view to just giving him some recovery time. And we'd also decided to move out of London at that point, and we were thinking maybe we'd look at some other options, some alternative schools. Like there was a State Steiner where we were going to move, and we thought, oh, maybe that would be a good idea. But the idea was we'd have 6 months where we'd recover and mend our sort of relationship with him, give him time to heal. Yeah.
So the 6 months, was that like a deschooling period? What happened during that 6 months for you?
Well,
or was it just totally like actually not thinking about home educating at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the internet, for me, as soon as I sort of think something comes into my awareness, I'm like, oh, let me read up on that. So I did dabble in. I didn't know anything about homeschooling. I hadn't met anyone who home educated. Actually, I knew one family who did, but followed a very school curriculum. So it wasn't something that I was interested in doing or felt was going to be helpful for Theo. So when I looked, it suggested anyone who was starting homeschooling did deschooling, which the advice I'd got was have a holiday, do what they love and play. And it was actually, it was about a month before school had finished. So, and we had about 3 months before we moved, and it was just gorgeous. It was just so lovely. Reconnecting, playing and chilling. And so he was 5 or 6 then, and my little girl was 3, and so there was lots of fun and play.
And so is that because you did D-school, was that did you include that in your D-school period? And how long did you D-school for in total?
Yeah, so at that point we hadn't thought what we were going to do, and then we moved, and then we met some families that were what they were unschoolers, and so I then sort of thought, well, I looked at unschool, I thought, oh, that sounds like us, that totally sounds like us. And bless them, they were so sweet because we were like, oh yeah, we're unschooling, but we were still like thinking, oh, we'll do a bit of English writing, and I'd feel better if we did a bit of this. This would make me feel good. If you were just doing a little bit of this or doing a little bit of that. And bless them, they weren't like, you're not bloody unschooling, you're dibbling and dabbling. They were really sweet. But that opened up a bit more on the internet for me to look into. And the suggestion was that if you're going to de-school, for every month that you've been at school, no, for every year you've been at school, do a month's de-schooling. And that's not just the child, that's the parent. So for us, I'd been in education, formal education, till I was 19, but my husband until he was 23. So we figured, well, 23 months of just letting go, just playing, exploring, following their interests, which was a lovely idea, quite mind-blowing. But yeah.
Yeah, so taking all that system out of you as parents as well as the children.
I think the kids, because Theo hadn't been in the school system for long, and he also hadn't bought into it in any which way. It wasn't his personality to be a people pleaser, and he thought it was a load of bullshit, that he hadn't taken it on at all. The kids didn't need any de-schooling. They were just like,
Wow.
oh, thank God you've arrived, you're with us now. But for Paul and I, it was really challenging. We would walk along and then come up against a wall that we really had to work through, and it was so much social conditioning to work through, so many fears, so much stuff that we hadn't realised that we'd taken on, and we're quite unconventional really in our approach to life, so it was a shock to see how much we'd bought into all of these societal and cultural norms. Huge.
I really like that notion of, because actually when I de-schooled, I didn't think about myself as an adult and the de-schooling thing. So I think that's a really good point. So when you went, so then you did your de-schooling, and then you decided, yes, we are going to do this. We're going to home educate. Did you go straight into unschooling because of the family you'd met, or did you dip into trying formal things, or what did that bit look like?
It looked a bit messy because I still had an agenda at that point. I still had some boxes to tick in my mind that, oh, if it looks like this, then I'll feel okay.
Yeah.
And so I still was bringing that stuff out, and bless them, the kids Theo was still, playing along, and I think he was just so relieved that it wasn't school. He was like, okay. But it was so beautiful when I think I read something like, if you're a radical unschooler, it's not what your picture of your child's life looks like, it's theirs. Buy into that. And when I got that, I was like, oh, this is awesome. The trust between us was just, there was just nothing. I've never experienced anything more joyful than that. And that was, it was so much better than that they've met all their math tasks for year one. It was just like, oh, to have that trust with your child where they just know they're accepted and approved of, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to support your picture of what your picture of life is. And I'm also really interested in what it is. I have no idea what it is. I'm curious, let me find out. That still is really amazing, and it's still something I have to come back to because I can get a bit lost in my own shit sometimes,
Yeah, so, and you talked about like doing loads of bits on, research on the internet, and it is quite a minefield out there of stuff. But so some of the stuff that you used initially, because actually they were, when we were chatting about it earlier, they would be really helpful, I think. So we will put that list on the podcast page of my website. But talk us through some of the things that you used that helped you to sort of?
Yeah, because I really struggle because I'm the sort of person that really likes to chat to people, to say, oh, blah, 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 you know, and work things through. And I didn't have anybody like that. And I found on the internet lots of people were talking about how useful that had been, that they'd had this community. And so I really, really longed for that. And actually, I found the question and answer Facebook group, a question and answer unschooling, radical unschooling Facebook group, where you could just post a question, you could even do it anonymously, and really experienced, but also really empathic, realistic, and compassionate sort of mums would respond. And it was just so lovely to have people who had been there, could support you, you know, were there in solidarity, and could help you move along with that journey a little bit. That has been really good resource for me. But we read the John Holt books to start with. I didn't actually find them as helpful as my husband did, just because we've got a different way of coming at it. But when I found Pamela Rickia, I found her podcast just invaluable. Like, I'd be cooking tea, just soaking it up. And it was just like going on a university course for radical unschooling. I was just like, just taking in the information and just processing and working through stuff. And it was intense. It was a real challenge. And I didn't have any real-time people I could talk to about it.
No.
Which was hard. And we found a radical unschooling camp, which a friend, one of those families that I told you about earlier, we'd moved again by then, had told us about. And the first year we went to that was amazing, just to be around loads of other families who were radically unschooling, and you could just chat to people. And,
You were saying actually about that, about your husband actually found that really useful,
Yeah.
because, you know, it is so often the main person who's at home with the children sort of takes that on, but it's really hard for the other person, whoever that is, isn't it, if
Yeah.
they're not around so much to
Yeah.
feel or see what's happening. So it was good
Yeah,
for him.
it was massive for him. I think he particularly found that, you know, when there's personal things that you struggle with, they come up when you do something like this. And to go along to a camp where suddenly there's loads of other people and you don't feel like you're the one person that's breaking away from society doing something that you're not even sure is the right thing, there's no one to reference point it to. It was just really comforting for him. And to be able to chat to other dads too, because there were lots of other dads that, like you say, had been going at a much slower pace with it because they're not there every day. And often they don't see all the tiny moments that are reassuring and impactful, and you don't necessarily have time to be able to share. Sometimes you can't even put them into words. And yeah, I think speaking to other dads was really, really helpful. Just to hear other people going through the same thing was good. Yeah.
And actually, sort of chatting about your partners kind of brings me on to the next thing. I think for home educators, it's such a massive decision to home educate your children, that naturally there is going to be possibly resistance from either friends, family, partner. Was that the case for you at all?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the advice is when you start unschooling or radically unschooling, don't tell your family and friends that you're unschooling or radically unschooling, because they'll just be like, what is that? Just say you're homeschooling and gradually they'll work it out. But I either missed that memo or in my normal style, probably just was like, I'm just going to say it as it is. And that was a big mistake, actually, because then it was all very new for us. We were still deschooling and still working it out a lot. And there we were having to make a stand for what we were doing to people who were completely doubting it and pulling it apart and needed reassurance themselves when we weren't in a strong position to do that. And we got very defensive, and actually it really impacted our relationships with our parents a lot. And it was a really, really hard time. The time where we really wanted support from them, it was the time we had that the least. And in terms of our relationship, for me, I feel like you know, with radical unschooling, it's not just about the education aspect, it's about your whole life. It's sort of a life philosophy, really. So, you know, you don't go in, you might go into it thinking this is how we're going to educate our kids, but actually, this is about how we're going to be in the world.
Mm.
And it calls for authenticity on so many levels that it's been hard, actually. But if you if what you want is something really real and authentic that actually really works on a very deep level and the foundations are really good, then and you're prepared to work through a lot of crap to get there, then it's worth it. But at times it's been really, really hard, and I think particularly hard for us because, you know, we live in, I guess, what other people would call remote Cornwall. There's not a radical unschooling community down here. There's not even an unschooling community. It's very spread out. Maybe in North Cornwall there's a lot more people. So there's not even support of people that are doing it like we do. And so, you know, that I think is really, really important. If we'd have thought that's what we were going to do, we would have looked for places to live where there was a strong community. I think it's really essential. And things are okay with our families now. They've kind of come to terms with it. We're less defensive, and you know, we found a way of sitting in it better.
And you're more experienced with what you can see that your children are like flourishing,
Yeah, and also we're not, you know, we're not. I think, you know, you feel so, you know, you're doing something countercultural, and a lot of people take it personally. You're not doing what they're doing, and you feel like you need to defend yourself, and which means that you can't therefore be real about the challenges you're having. And that is really painful, because it's not a perfect thing, it's a messy thing, as is all aspects of life. But it's like people are like, well, you're doing something different, you should be, you know, you better make sure it's flipping, you know, really good. You know. Yeah.
Do you get people, or did you get family perhaps that sort of when they start to understand a bit more about the unschooling, the radically unschooling, that sort of question, well, how are they going to get that broad learning experience? Does that
Yeah.
has that played on your mind at all? And
It's interesting. It hasn't played on my mind so much. I'm a bit of an idealist and I really trust this process. And I think because I had that like university type experience where I totally immersed myself in it, I, you know, I love my kids so much that there's no way I would have taken the risk unless I felt like it was worth it. You know, this was the right thing to do. But obviously my family hadn't been through that process, and so they were worried. And actually my partner sometimes thinks, well, don't you think it would be good to make them do a few things so that they got that experience? I think that is a normal, and some of it is a valid way of thinking. Um, um, but I think after time, what my family have seen, certainly my mum, who I'm closest to, has seen, is that they get the opportunity to immerse themselves very deeply into the thing that they're absolutely, or the things that they're really passionate about. And what's really fascinating about that is when you let go and allow that to happen, you don't do it with the expectation that something else is going to come from it, but actually what comes from it is loads of other things. So it's a bit like one of those pie charts with a circle in the middle and then loads of little things, arms come off it. So my son is really passionate, enthusiastic about gaming, which is the classic stereotypical radical unschooling child, and not all of them are, but he is. And he, through gaming, he's got so into music, but really interesting music. He's got really interested in anime. He's got really interested in exploring taboo subjects, cultural norms, cultural issues, war, Napoleonic war. I mean, it just goes on. There's probably loads that I don't even know about, but these are the things that I've noticed. Grammar, massive one. He's always correcting people. It's quite embarrassing, correcting his friends about grammar when they're writing. You know, his typing. I mean, it's bonkers, isn't it, Sarah? Like how
Yeah, it
fast
really
he
is.
types is insane. I mean, he's not learned that. He just learned that going along. Um,
And it's given,
yeah.
it's almost like I can see it. I know your children, and it it's it's given them the thirst for learning. So it kind of, I guess you might feel safe in the fact that whatever they want to learn, they 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 will give. They've
Mm,
got that thirst to do it. It's
mm.
not because it's kind of not being forced down their throat. So
Yeah, and I think I certainly see my role, which is, you know, I've had to shed a few skins of what I thought I should be and what I thought they needed to give them space to explore that themselves. But what I'm understanding now my role is, and this has been a journey, is to be really in touch with what my needs are and to follow what my interests are and to create this really rich learning environment where I'm, Sandra Dodd coined this term strewing. So, like, I go out for a walk with the dog and I find loads of grass seeds and I might just put them on the table and I get back, not expecting the kids to pick them up and do anything with them. And sometimes they don't. The other day I was knitting and I had all of this beautiful wool out, which it's lush, I love it. And Bella suddenly, so she's 6, she suddenly just grabbed some of the wool and she was making these like, she's passionate about her soft toys and animals, and she was making these. She opened the window and put the wool outside, and she put bait on the end to capture more teddies and bring them into a teddy world. So I think, by me and my husband, we're both really creative. That's our sort of thing. Being creative and bringing in our passion for learning and exploring and curiosity, that tips off into that, gives them permission to do that too. And there's no expectation that that's going to happen. That's the hard thing. It's like, you might start off knitting because you think, oh, maybe they'll start knitting, or they might start creating something with some wool. I certainly was in that place when I first started, but now I'm knitting because I love it. I've got no idea whether they'll either notice it, but they do on some level. On
mm,
some level, it's doing something.
mm,
Yeah.
that's beautiful, actually,
Mm.
really. And I think it's totally it's totally real. And I think, like, having had the experience of like the national curriculum, which is not built for the future, it's actually
Mm.
we don't know what that future will look like for
Mm.
these children. But if they've got that deep immersive love of learning and that creativity, which is missing from so many
Mm.
young children these days, that's what universities, that's what businesses are calling out, that they
Mm.
want from these young people. So it does sound like you're doing the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so we were so actually I was going to chip in there and talk about the app. So
Yeah.
so the app sort of helps unschoolers to store that evidence, store that progress
Mm.
of their children. But you can use that sort of not against the
Mm-hmm.
national curriculum. So you're actually, so those really beautiful moments where you want to just group some of those
Mm.
creative things into subjects, but just as a way of storing them to be able to see the progress, can happen
Mm.
for unschoolers as well as for those that perhaps are formally learning it.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I mean, there is a reality that things are changing on the homeschooling front anyway, and the need to maybe provide evidence and document stuff for the government, local councils, etc. I think the app is a really good way of being able to do that without having to force unschooling into looking a certain way.
Mm,
So I think it would be helpful.
thank you. So the other thing we were going to just touch base
Mm.
on was that sort of uh, topical subject with home
Mm.
educating anyway, is about like socialization and that kind of thing. Do you think for unschoolers, does it look different?
Mm.
How does it feel kind of when you're thinking about sort of attending groups and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a massive question. I mentioned before that as unschoolers or radical unschoolers or even homeschoolers, we're doing something that's not of the norm. So people are expecting it to look good. And so I think even within our own community, we're not being honest about the challenges, because you mentioned social, people are so fed up of people going, oh, your kids must be so isolated, that they're like, no, no. But actually, the reality is, for my family, and this will be very, very different from other radical unschoolers, certainly the town that we used to live in, there's a thriving radical unschooling community. Might ask myself why we left that town. But where we are now, like I mentioned before, there isn't. And socialising for my son is challenging, because he wants to be around people that accept him, and he understands on a very basic level when people disapprove of him, even if they don't say it. And he doesn't want to be around those sorts of people. And it doesn't mean he wants to be with people that game all day, but he wants to be with people who get him and aren't afraid of stuff. And he doesn't have to deal with what he sees as the pettiness that people kind of bring in. And he wants to say to someone, oh, do you want to come over to play? And their parents aren't like, yeah, but as long as he's not going to be on the computer, you know, that would be really painful for him, because that is a huge part of what he loves and wants to share with people. So yeah, you can be his friend, but you can't share that. So, and he gets that. And so socializing is definitely more challenging. There's less of a pool of people down here, and then within that pool he might not even click with those people. So we are finding it challenging. He's got amazing online friends, and I know a lot of people, and even us when we started, we're like, we just want him to have real friends in real life. But they are real people,
Yeah.
and he is getting so much from them, and I would love to see them in person. I'd love them to be bustling around our house, and I'd love him to be going into their house. That's not the reality, and at least he's got them, and we're working really hard to sort of build that, but it's definitely not what we want and what we hope for. But it's better than what he had at school. He had great friends at school. The social element was great, but he would prefer not to go to school anyway. And I think, in all honesty, we wish there was a school where they would love to go, because that would be awesome. And where it was a wonderful place to be and explore life and hang out with your friends that you love. That would be great, but it doesn't exist in my book. So this is the best option. And with my little girl, it's okay, because, you know, she's got different passions, and she's made friends with kids who aren't radical unschoolers. It doesn't matter so much, because I don't know, maybe she's younger, or the gaming isn't one of her passions, but, you know, she's got different needs, and they're able to be met at different groups with different
I do
people.
think it's I mean, a lot of it actually does come down to location, because, you know, Cornwall is so remote. You meet people and they are travelling sometimes an hour to go to a group.
Yeah.
But at the same time, home educating is becoming bigger, and we're seeing more and more people joining different groups.
Yeah, more people are moving. Yeah.
So hopefully for your son, over time, that will give him more options. But
Yeah.
it is hard, but
I do think as well, it's not just, I think people are like, oh, you know, you're radical unschoolers and that's bang, that's it. But I think there's so many different additions to that. So you might be radical, but it's like, also, what are our values? Because you're going to want to hang out with people with the same values. You know, like we love, just long, lazy days at home where people come over and it's not a big occasion and you're just grazing food and playing. That's like our perfect. So you've got to find people who want that same thing too. And that's not just, like, there might be radical unschoolers that hate that idea. So it's not just like, oh, we're radical unschoolers. Like, it's about being people, isn't it?
Finding your tribe, isn't it?
Totally. It really is, yeah.
And so I guess as well, when you think about the kind of socialisation of school, actually, people sort of deem that to be good for children, but actually, in reality, they're kind of segregated into these age groups, and actually that's, you know, it's actually a really beautiful thing when you see home educators and you see like 12, 13 year olds helping playing with 5 year olds. And I you know, from my background in school, I always felt quite sad that it was all kind
Yeah.
of made up like that, really.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it's interesting because that's been my daughter's experience, and the value of having like a 10-year-old showing her how to do cartwheels and be her big sister, and then has been beautiful. But for my son, he just wants boys of his own age, boys or girls of his own age and a little bit older to hang out with, and that that is different. So I think it is an individual thing. And I think when I started homeschooling, all I heard was what you've just said. Oh, it's the beauty of like having all these angels. And I had this picture, this ideal. Oh, that's what it is. But my son didn't fit into that.
no.
And so then you feel a little bit like, ah. And I think, but I think there's a lot of people who don't fit into that sort of mainstream idea of
Yeah.
homeschooling in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. um, and do you think there's any advice that you would give anyone, you know, from your experience, any advice that you'd give anyone going into unschooling?
I don't know about advice. I still feel very inexperienced, and we're still deschooling. I mean, we've only been radically unschooling for 2 years, so we've probably just coming out the other side of that. The advice I would give is I think community is absolutely massive. And if you can't create that in real life, get really hooked into something that you can find helpful online because you really, really need that. And what we didn't do, the other thing that we didn't do is we literally went from one day to the next day. We removed all limits on bedtime, screens, food, and the absolute massive advice is do not do that. Go gradually, go slowly. If something's working, you know, like if your kids go to bed at 7:30 and they love that and they get a fresh night's sleep and they wake up at 7:30, you get an evening, it all works for you. Don't mess with that. Our bedtimes weren't working, so we you know, we looked at that. But we did go literally hardcore, just one day to the next, and that was really intense. So I would say, I think Sandra Dodd says this, you know, do a little, change a little, play a little, change a little, do a little, play a little, or something like that,
That's
and just
nice.
go really slowly because it is really, really intense. Find at least one person that you can talk to that's a bit further along the path than you, and you know, understand that you're going to hit a lot of fears and stuff, and that doesn't mean, I think that's when a lot of people go, oh, it's not for us. Actually, it's a really good sign, and just push through because there's so much gorgeousness along the way. There's so much it's worth diving into all that stuff.
And that kind of brings me to the end, really. Come on, give us your best bit for the
My best bit,
of the journey so far, because it's ever changing, isn't it? Anyway.
yeah. I think one of the best bits is is been finding myself, really. I think giving my kids permission to be themselves fully in all their glory has given me permission to find myself. And then when we both meet in that space and we look at each other in the eye and it's like total crazy honesty, and I'm being a bit of a like, you know, craziness, and they're just like, yeah, that is mighty. I mean, it's, you just immediately, I'm like, how do I recreate this again? You know, oh my gosh, you know, but yeah, it just happens. It's just so beautiful. That's one of the real gifts. Just this deeper relationship than I've ever experienced or imagined was sort of possible, and it is. It's amazing.
That's made my little hairs on my arms go up.
Yeah, and I think that has happened for my husband and I. I think, yeah, I think it means our relationship is much deeper and much more real, and we've learnt to listen and communicate with each other so much better than we would have known how to, I think. Yeah.
Oh, it's lovely. Thank you. Thank you for your time today,
Oh, well,
Sarah.
thank you.
I hope you lovely listeners have found that useful today. And if you've got any further questions that you want to ask, email them in for the question and answer sessions. And until then, keep calm and carry on with the journey.